The black Mercedes SUV rolled slowly through the familiar streets of Newark, New Jersey. Behind the wheel sat one of the most recognizable figures in sports history. Shaquille O'Neal was heading home from a business meeting in Manhattan when he decided to take a detour through his old neighborhood. Something always pulled him back to these streets where his journey began. The autumn afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Shaq rolled down his window, breathing in the familiar sense of his childhood. Corner stores, small restaurants, and apartment buildings lined the street just as they had 30 years ago. Some things had changed, but the heart of the neighborhood remained the same. As he stopped at a red light, his eyes wandered to a bus stop on the corner. An elderly woman sat alone on the worn wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a faded blue coat that had seen better days, and her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun. Something about her posture, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her surroundings, caught his attention. The light turned green, but Shaq found himself pulling over to the curb instead of driving on. He couldn't shake the feeling that he knew this woman. There was something achingly familiar about her profile, the gentle slope of her shoulders, the careful way she arranged her worn leather purse beside her. He sat in his car for a moment, studying her face. Then it hit him like a freight train. Mrs. Harrison, his sixth-grade teacher from Lincoln Elementary School. The woman who had changed the entire course of his life. Shaq's hands trembled slightly as he turned off the engine. Could it really be her? After all these years? He had to be sure. Stepping out of his SUV, he felt like that awkward 11-year-old boy again. The one who was already 6 feet tall and still growing. The one who felt like a giant among his classmates. He approached the bus stop slowly, his heart pounding. As he got closer, there was no doubt. It was definitely Mrs. Harrison. She had aged, of course, but her kind eyes and gentle smile were exactly as he remembered them. The woman who had seen potential in him when everyone else saw only trouble. "Excuse me," Shaq said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Harrison?" The elderly woman looked up, and her eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, she seemed confused, as if trying to place this massive figure standing before her. Then recognition dawned across her face like sunrise. "Shaquille," she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Shaquille O'Neal? Is that really you?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, that familiar respectful tone from his childhood automatically returning. "It's me." Mrs. Harrison stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She was much smaller than he remembered, more fragile. The top of her head barely reached his chest, but her presence still commanded the same respect it always had. "My goodness," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "Look at you. I've watched you on television all these years, but seeing you in person, you're even taller than I imagined." Shaq chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "You always said I'd keep growing." "That I did?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with the same warmth he remembered from those long-ago classroom days. "I told you that size was a gift, not a burden. Do you remember?" "I remember everything you taught me, Mrs. Harrison. Every single word." They stood there for a moment, teacher and former student, both marveling at the strange twist of fate that had brought them together on this ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Cars passed by, their drivers oblivious to the reunion taking place at the humble bus stop. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Mrs. Harrison asked, settling back onto the bench and patting the space beside her. Shaq sat down carefully, the old bench creaking under his weight. "Just driving through, remembering the old days," he said. "I had a meeting in the city and thought I'd take the long way home. Good thing I did." Mrs. Harrison nodded, but Shaq noticed something in her expression that concerned him. She looked tired, worn down in a way that went beyond simple aging. Her coat, while clean and well-maintained, was clearly old. Her shoes had been resoled multiple times, and her purse, though carried with dignity, showed signs of constant use. "Marie, you waiting for the bus?" he asked gently. "Yes, I was visiting the clinic downtown," she replied, then quickly added, "Just a routine checkup, nothing serious." But Shaq caught the slight hesitation in her voice, the way she glanced away when she mentioned the clinic. He knew that look. It was the same expression he'd seen on his mother's face years ago when money was tight and she was trying to hide their struggles from him. "Mrs. Harrison," he said carefully, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how have you been? I mean, really, how have you been?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching the traffic pass by. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "Oh, you know how it is for old teachers like me. The pension doesn't stretch as far as it used to. But I'm managing just fine, don't you worry about me." The words were brave, but Shaq could hear the truth beneath them. This woman, who had given 40 years of her life to educating children, who had believed in him when no one else would, was struggling. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Tell me about retirement," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Are you enjoying it?" Mrs. Harrison's laugh was gentle but tinged with something that might have been sadness. "Well, it's certainly different from the classroom. I miss the children terribly. I volunteer at the literacy center when I can, helping kids learn to read. It keeps me busy." "That sounds wonderful," Shaq said, though his heart was breaking. Even in her own difficult circumstances, she was still giving back, still helping children who needed her. The bus appeared in the distance, its diesel engine rumbling as it approached the stop. Mrs. Harrison began gathering her things, preparing to leave. "Wait," Shaq said suddenly. "Can I give you a ride? My car is right there." Mrs. Harrison looked at the gleaming SUV and shook her head. "Oh no, dear, I couldn't impose. The bus is perfectly fine." "Please," Shaq insisted, standing up as the bus pulled to the curb. "It would be my honor. After everything you did for me, it's the least I can do." For a moment, Mrs. Harrison hesitated. Then she looked up at this gentle giant who had once been her student, and something in his eyes convinced her. "Well," she said with a small smile, "I suppose it would be nice to catch up properly." As Shaq helped her into his car, adjusting the seat and making sure she was comfortable, his mind was already racing. This chance encounter felt like more than just coincidence. It felt like destiny. The woman who had changed his life was right here, right now, and she needed help. He thought about all the success he'd achieved, all the money he'd made, all the opportunities that had come his way, and it all traced back to this classroom, to this teacher who had seen something in a troubled kid that no one else could see. As they drove through the streets of Newark, Mrs. Harrison pointing out changes in the neighborhood and sharing memories of his school days, Shaq made a silent promise to himself. Whatever Mrs. Harrison needed, whatever struggles she was facing, he was going to find a way to help. Not because he had to, but because she had earned it 1,000 times over. The reunion that had started by pure chance was about to become something much bigger. Something that would remind the world that the most important lessons in life often come from the most unexpected teachers, and that gratitude, when acted upon, has the power to change everything. As they drove through the quiet streets, Mrs. Harrison settled into the comfortable leather seat and gazed out the window. The luxury of the vehicle wasn't lost on her, but she seemed more interested in watching the familiar neighborhoods pass by than in the expensive surroundings. "You know," she said softly, "I still remember the first day you walked into my classroom." Shaq glanced over at her, curious. "Really? What do you remember about it?" Mrs. Harrison chuckled, the sound carrying decades of teaching memories. "Oh, my goodness, how could I forget? You were already taller than most of the 8th graders, and you tried so hard to squeeze yourself into that tiny desk. Your knees were practically touching your chin. I felt like such a freak," Shaq admitted, the old insecurity creeping into his voice. "Everyone stared at me wherever I went." "I noticed that," Mrs. Harrison said, turning to look at him directly. "But you know what else I noticed? You were trying so hard to make yourself smaller. You'd hunch your shoulders, keep your head down, apologize for taking up space. It broke my heart." Shaq pulled up to a red light and found himself transported back to that 11-year-old boy who felt like he didn't belong anywhere. He'd been moved between schools multiple times, teachers complaining that he was disruptive, that his size made other students uncomfortable, that he didn't pay attention. "I was causing problems everywhere I went," he said quietly. "I figured it would be the same in your class." "Oh, you were definitely a handful," Mrs. Harrison laughed. "But not in the way you think. You weren't mean or cruel like some of the other children who acted out. You were just lost, and so very lonely. The light turned green, but Shaq's mind was firmly planted in the past. He remembered those early days in Mrs. Harrison's 6th grade class, how different it felt from the beginning. She never made him feel like a burden or a problem to be solved. "Do you remember what happened that first week?" Mrs. Harrison asked. "When Tommy Richardson and his friends were picking on little Kevin during lunch?" Shaq's face lit up with recognition. "I do remember that. Kevin was crying because they took his lunch money again." "And what did you do?" "I walked over and told them to give it back," Shaq said, the memory becoming clearer. "I didn't touch anyone, just stood there. They got scared and ran away." "Exactly," Mrs. Harrison said with satisfaction. "And when the principal called me in because the other teachers were worried about you being aggressive, do you remember what I told him?" Shaq shook his head. He'd never known about that meeting. "I told him that you weren't aggressive at all. You were protective. There's a huge difference. I said that any child who uses his size to protect smaller kids instead of bullying them has something special inside. That's when I knew you were going to be just fine." They turned onto Mrs. Harrison Street, and Shaq slowed the car, not wanting their conversation to end. This was a side of his school story he'd never heard before. "But I was failing most of my classes," he pointed out. "I couldn't concentrate, couldn't sit still." "Because no one had ever taught you how to use that energy properly," Mrs. Harrison replied. "You had all this power, physical and mental, but no one showed you how to channel it. That became my mission." Shaq parked in front of a modest apartment building, but neither of them moved to get out. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow through the windshield. "I remember you keeping me after school," Shaq said. "Almost every day for months. Not as punishment," Mrs. Harrison clarified. "As opportunity. Those after-school sessions weren't about catching up on missed work. They were about teaching you to believe in yourself." She was right. Those afternoon sessions had been different from any tutoring he'd received before. Mrs. Harrison didn't just help him with math problems or reading assignments. She talked to him about dreams, about possibilities, about the kind of man he could become. "You used to tell me that being big was a gift," Shaq remembered. "But I didn't understand what you meant back then." "You were so angry about your height," Mrs. Harrison said. "You saw it as a curse that made you different from everyone else. But I could see the potential. I knew that someday, that size would open doors for you that most people could only dream of." Shaq thought about all the doors that had indeed opened because of his height. Basketball scholarships, NBA contracts, movie deals, business opportunities. But, as a kid, all he could see was how it made him stand out in ways he didn't want to. "There was one day," Mrs. Harrison continued, "when you came to class with a black eye. Do you remember?" Shaq's expression grew serious. "Yeah, I remember. You told everyone you fell down, but I knew better. Someone had been picking on you, calling you names, and when you finally stood up for yourself, they made sure you paid for it." "The older kids from the high school," Shaq admitted. "They kept calling me a giant freak. I tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop." "That was the day I made a decision about you," Mrs. Harrison said. "I realized that you needed more than just academic help. You needed someone to believe in you completely, without reservation." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Shaq watched as she flipped through pages covered in her neat handwriting. "I started keeping notes about your progress," she explained. "Not just grades, but real progress. How you helped other students, how you solved problems, how you grew as a person." Shaq was amazed. After all these years, she still had those notes. "Listen to this," Mrs. Harrison said, finding a particular page. "November 15th, Shaquille stayed after school to help move boxes from the supply room. Didn't complain once, even though it meant missing the bus and walking home. When I thanked him, he said he was happy to help because the classroom felt like home." Shaq felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had said that, and he had meant it. Mrs. Harrison's classroom had been the first place in school where he felt like he belonged. December 3rd, she continued reading. "Shaquille scored 95% on his math test. When I congratulated him, he asked if he could help tutor the students who were struggling. He's developing into a natural leader. You saw all that in me when I couldn't see it in myself, Shaq said quietly. That's what teachers do, Mrs. Harrison replied simply. We see the person our students can become, even when they can't see it yet. She closed the notebook and looked at him with the same warm expression she'd worn all those years ago in the classroom. But the most important thing I tried to teach you wasn't about math or reading, she said. It was about character. I wanted you to understand that your size would give you power, but power without character is dangerous. Power with character can change the world. Shaq sat in silence, processing her words. He thought about his career, his success, his platform. Had he used his power wisely? Had he honored the lessons she'd taught him? I tried to remember what you taught me, he said finally. In basketball, in business, in life. I always tried to use my success to help others. I know you have. Mrs. Harrison said with pride. I've watched you from afar all these years. Every charitable foundation, every scholarship program, every time you've helped someone in need. That's the boy I knew you could become. As they sat together in the fading daylight, Shaq realized that this reunion was about more than just chance. It was about coming full circle, about recognizing the foundation that had made everything else possible. Mrs. Harrison hadn't just been his teacher. She'd been the architect of his character, the person who'd taught him that true strength comes from lifting others up. Now, seeing her in need, he understood that it was his turn to be the teacher, to show her the same unwavering belief and support that she had shown him all those years ago. That night, Shaq couldn't sleep. He lay in his massive custom-made bed staring at the ceiling of his Beverly Hills mansion, but his mind was 3,000 miles away in Newark. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mrs. Harrison sitting on that bus stop bench, her dignity intact despite the worn coat and careful way she counted change for bus fare. He kept thinking about their conversation, about the notebook full of observations she'd kept about him all those years ago. The woman who had invested so much in his future was now struggling to make ends meet, and that thought gnawed at him like a physical pain. By morning, Shaq had made a decision. He needed to know more about Mrs. Harrison's situation, but he also knew she was too proud to tell him the full truth. If he was going to help her properly, he'd need to do some investigating on his own. His first call was to his old school, Lincoln Elementary. After being transferred several times, he finally reached the current principal, Dr. Williams, who remembered Mrs. Harrison well. Oh, yes, Mrs. Harrison was a legend here, Dr. Williams said warmly. She retired about 8 years ago, but not by choice. Budget cuts forced several early retirements. It was heartbreaking because she was one of our best teachers. What do you mean, not by choice? Shaq asked, already feeling his anger rise. The district was facing major financial problems. They offered buyout packages to teachers who were close to retirement age. Mrs. Harrison was only 57 at the time, but she took the deal because she knew it would save the jobs of younger teachers with families to support. Shaq felt sick. Mrs. Harrison had sacrificed her own financial security to protect her colleagues, and now she was paying the price for that generosity. Is there anything else you can tell me about her situation? He asked carefully. Dr. Williams hesitated. Well, I probably shouldn't share too much, but since you're asking out of concern, I know she lost her husband about 5 years ago. Cancer. I heard the medical bills were substantial, and her pension, because she retired early, is much smaller than it should have been. After hanging up, Shaq sat in his home office, surrounded by awards and photos from his playing days, feeling a growing sense of urgency. He called his assistant and asked her to clear his schedule for the day. He had work to do. His next call was to Robert Chen, his financial advisor and longtime friend. If anyone could help him understand the full scope of Mrs. Harrison's situation and figure out the best way to help, it would be Robert. I need you to do some research for me, Shaq explained, telling Robert about the reunion and what he'd learned so far. But I want this kept completely confidential. This woman changed my life, and I'm not going to let her struggle if I can help it. Of course, Robert replied. Give me a few hours and I'll see what I can find out through public records and other sources. While waiting for Robert's callback, Shaq decided to take a drive. He found himself heading back to Newark, this time with a specific destination in mind. He wanted to see the literacy center where Mrs. Harrison volunteered, to get a better sense of how she was spending her retirement. The Newark Community Literacy Center was housed in a converted storefront in a strip mall. The sign out front was faded, and the building looked like it was held together by determination and hope rather than proper funding. Shaq parked his car and walked inside. The interior was cramped but warm, filled with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with donated books. A young woman at the front desk looked up in shock when she saw him. "Oh my goodness, you're Shaquille O'Neal," she gasped. "Yes, ma'am," Shaq smiled. "I'm looking for information about one of your volunteers, Mrs. Harrison. She's a former teacher of mine." The woman's face lit up. "Mrs. Harrison, she's amazing. She's here 4 days a week working with kids who are struggling to read. The children absolutely love her." 4 days a week? Shaq was surprised. That was nearly a full-time schedule for someone who was supposed to be retired. "She never takes a penny for it either," the woman continued. "She says teaching is her calling, not her job. We've tried to pay her something, even just gas money, but she always refuses." Shaq walked around the center, observing the setup. It was clear they were operating on a shoestring budget. The computers were old, the furniture was donated, and everything showed signs of heavy use and careful maintenance. "How do you fund this place?" he asked. "Mostly through donations and small grants," the woman explained. "It's always a struggle. We serve about 200 kids a year, but we could help so many more if we had the resources." As Shaq left the center, his phone rang. It was Robert calling back with his research results. "I've got some information for you," Robert said, his voice serious. "Mrs. Harrison's financial situation is worse than you probably realized." Shaq found a quiet parking lot and listened as Robert laid out the facts. Mrs. Harrison's pension was indeed small because of her early retirement. Her husband's cancer treatment had cost over $300,000, most of which wasn't covered by insurance. They'd had to sell their house and deplete their savings. Now she was living in a rent-controlled apartment, but even that was becoming difficult to afford. "There's something else," Robert continued. "The building where she lives is being sold. The new owners plan to renovate and convert it to market-rate housing. She's going to have to move within 6 months, and finding affordable housing in that area is nearly impossible." Shaq felt his heart sink. Mrs. Harrison was facing homelessness, and she hadn't said a word about it during their reunion. Her pride was keeping her from asking for help, even from someone who had the means to provide. "What are her monthly expenses?" Shaq asked. Robert read off the numbers: rent, utilities, food, medication, transportation. Even living as frugally as possible, Mrs. Harrison was barely making it month to month. One unexpected expense, one medical emergency, and she would be in serious trouble. "There's one more thing," Robert said quietly. "I found out why she was at that clinic yesterday. She's been skipping her heart medication because she can't afford it. She's trying to stretch a 30-day prescription over 2 months. Shaq closed, his eyes feeling anger and sadness wash over him in equal measure. The woman who had given everything to help children succeed was now rationing her own medication to make ends meet. It was unacceptable. "Robert, I want you to set up a meeting with the best estate planning attorney you know," Shaq said, his voice firm with resolve. "I also want you to research that literacy center she volunteers at and find out who owns her apartment building." "What are you thinking?" Robert asked. "I'm thinking it's time for me to return the favor," Shaq replied. "Mrs. Harrison invested in my future when I had nothing to offer. Now I'm going to invest in hers." After ending the call, Shaq sat in his car for a long time, thinking about everything he'd learned. Mrs. Harrison's situation was complex, and throwing money at it wouldn't be enough. He needed a plan that would address her immediate needs while preserving her dignity and giving her a sense of purpose. More than that, he realized this was bigger than just helping one person. Mrs. Harrison's story was probably repeated thousands of times across the country. Dedicated teachers who had given their lives to education were struggling in retirement, forgotten by the society they had served. As the sun began to set over Newark, Shaq made a decision that would change not just Mrs. Harrison's life, but the lives of countless others. He was going to do something meaningful, something lasting, something that would honor the legacy of teachers everywhere. The boy who had once felt lost and alone was about to become the man who would ensure that the teacher who saved him would never be forgotten or left behind. The plan forming in his mind was ambitious, but then again, Mrs. Harrison had always taught him to dream big. 3 weeks after their chance meeting, Shaq had everything in place. He'd worked around the clock with his team of lawyers, financial advisors, and contractors to put together what he hoped would be the surprise of Mrs. Harrison's lifetime. But first he needed to make sure she would be home on Saturday morning. He called her on Thursday evening, his palms sweating like he was a nervous kid again. "Mrs. Harrison, it's Shaquille," he said when she answered. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Oh, not at all, dear," she replied warmly. "I was just finishing up some reading. How are you?" "I'm doing well, thank you. Listen, I was wondering if you'd be home this Saturday morning around 10. I'd love to stop by and visit if that's okay with you." There was a slight pause. "Well, I suppose that would be fine. But Shaquille, you don't need to worry about checking on me. I'm managing just fine." "I know you are," Shaq said gently. "I just want to see you again, maybe bring you some of those chocolate chip cookies you used to love. Do you still like them?" Mrs. Harrison's laugh was music to his ears. "I can't believe you remember that. Yes, I still have quite the sweet tooth." "Perfect. I'll see you Saturday at 10. After hanging up, Shaq couldn't help but smile. Mrs. Harrison had no idea that he'd spent the past 3 weeks quietly purchasing her apartment building, planning a complete renovation of her unit, and setting up something that would change her life forever. Saturday morning arrived with crisp October air and bright sunshine. Shaq pulled up to Mrs. Harrison's building in a convoy that included 2 moving trucks, a van full of contractors, and a small film crew he'd hired to document the moment. He wanted to capture this day, not for publicity, but because he knew it would be a memory he'd treasure forever. He walked up to Mrs. Harrison's door alone, carrying a box of cookies from her favorite bakery that he'd tracked down after calling 3 former colleagues from Lincoln Elementary. When she opened the door, her face lit up with genuine joy. "Shaquille, right on time," she said, ushering him inside. "Please come in, I just made some fresh coffee." Her apartment was small but immaculate. Everything was old but well-maintained, and Shaq could see touches of the teacher she'd always been. Books lined every available surface, and student artwork from years past decorated the walls. It was clearly the home of someone who had devoted her life to learning and teaching. "Mrs. Harrison," Shaq said, setting down the cookies and taking her hands in his massive ones. "I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll hear me out before you say anything." She looked up at him with curious eyes. "Of course, dear. What is it?" "Do you remember what you taught me about gifts?" he asked. "About how we're supposed to use what we've been given to help others?" "I remember," she said slowly. "Well, you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. You saw potential in a lost, angry kid when everyone else just saw problems. You changed the entire course of my life." Mrs. Harrison's eyes began to glisten. "Shaquille, you don't need to thank me. Seeing the man you've become is thanks enough." "But that's where you're wrong," Shaq said gently. "Gratitude without action is just empty words. And I found out some things about your situation that you didn't tell me." Mrs. Harrison looked away, embarrassed. "I don't know what you mean." "I know about the medical bills. I know about having to sell your house. I know about the building being sold and you having to move. And I know you've been skipping your heart medication to save money." Tears started rolling down Mrs. Harrison's cheeks. "How did you?" "I never wanted anyone to know. I've always taken care of myself." "And you still will," Shaq assured her. "But sometimes even the strongest people need help. You taught me that it's okay to accept kindness from others." He walked over to the window and looked down at the street below where his team was waiting patiently. "Mrs. Harrison, I bought this building," he said simply. She stared at him in shock. "You did what?" "I bought the building, which means you never have to worry about being forced to move again. This is your home for as long as you want it to be." Mrs. Harrison sat down heavily in her chair, overwhelmed. Shaquille, I can't let you do that. It's too much. I'm not done yet, Shaq said with a smile. I also brought some friends with me today. They're downstairs waiting, and they're going to completely renovate your apartment. New kitchen, new bathroom, new everything. It'll still be your home, just more comfortable. I don't understand, Mrs. Harrison whispered. Shaq knelt down beside her chair, bringing himself closer to her eye level. Mrs. Harrison, you spent 40 years investing in children. You gave up your own financial security to save other teachers' jobs. You volunteer 4 days a week helping kids learn to read, and you won't even accept gas money. You've spent your entire life giving, and now it's time for someone to give back to you. She was crying openly now, but Shaq wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said, his voice filled with excitement. I want to offer you a job. A job? She repeated, confused. I'm starting a foundation. It's going to help retired teachers who are struggling financially, and it's going to fund literacy programs in underserved communities. I want you to run it. Mrs. Harrison looked at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. You want me to what? I want you to be the director of the Harrison O'Neill Education Foundation, Shaq explained. You'd have a staff, a real budget, and the ability to help thousands of teachers and students across the country. The salary would be more than enough for you to live comfortably, with full health benefits and a proper retirement plan. But I'm 73 years old, Mrs. Harrison protested. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know everything about education, about helping children, about the challenges teachers face, Shaq countered. You understand the problems better than any administrator or consultant ever could. And age? Mrs. Harrison, you've got more energy and passion than people half your age. She sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything he'd told her. Finally, she looked up at him with those same wise eyes that had guided him through 6th grade. Why are you doing all this? She asked softly. Because 30 years ago, an amazing teacher saw something in a troubled kid that no one else could see. She invested her time, her energy, and her heart in helping him become the man he was meant to be. That kid grew up to have more success than he ever dreamed possible, and he never forgot the woman who made it all happen. Shaq stood up and walked back to the window. There's a whole team downstairs waiting to start making your apartment beautiful. There's paperwork for the foundation that my lawyers have prepared. And there's a new car parked outside with your name on it, because I noticed you've been taking the bus everywhere. Mrs. Harrison was laughing through her tears now. A new car? Shaquille O'Neal, you are completely out of your mind. Maybe so. Shaq grinned. But I learned from the best teacher in the world that when you have the power to change someone's life for the better, you do it. No questions asked. He offered her his hand. So what do you say, Mrs. Harrison? Ready to start the next chapter of your life? She took his hand and stood up, her face radiant with joy and possibility. I say that 6th grade boy who used to sit in the back of my classroom turned out even better than I ever imagined. As they walked toward the door together, Mrs. Harrison paused and looked back at her small apartment one last time. When she turned to face forward again, she wasn't just looking at a doorway. She was looking at a future filled with purpose, security, and the chance to make a difference in countless lives. The teacher who had spent her career opening doors for others was about to walk through the biggest door of all. 1 year later, Mrs. Harrison stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom in Chicago, looking out at an audience of over 500 people. Teachers, principals, superintendents, and education advocates filled every seat, all gathered for the first annual Harrison O'Neill Education Foundation Conference. The woman who had once counted bus fare was now addressing the nation's top educators about supporting retired teachers and improving literacy programs. When I first became a teacher 43 years ago, Mrs. Harrison began, her voice clear and confident. I never imagined I'd be standing here today talking about the power of believing in our students. But life has a funny way of coming full circle. In the back of the room, Shaq watched with pride as his former teacher commanded the attention of hundreds of people. The transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't happened overnight. The first few months after that Saturday morning surprise had been a whirlwind. While contractors renovated Mrs. Harrison's apartment, turning it into a beautiful, comfortable home, She had thrown herself into learning about foundation management, with the same dedication she'd once brought to teaching sixth graders. Shaq had hired the best consultants and advisors to help her, but Mrs. Harrison's natural instincts for education and her deep understanding of teachers' needs had made her a natural leader. Within 6 months, the foundation had processed over 300 applications for assistance from struggling retired teachers. We've learned that the challenges facing retired educators are more widespread than anyone realized, Mrs. Harrison continued her speech. Teachers who gave their lives to shaping young minds are now choosing between medication and groceries. They're losing their homes, skipping medical care, and living in poverty after decades of service. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Mrs. Harrison had become a powerful advocate, her personal story giving weight to every statistic she shared. The foundation's work had indeed grown beyond what either Shaq or Mrs. Harrison had initially imagined. They'd provided emergency financial assistance to retired teachers in 43 states. They'd funded literacy programs in over 200 schools. They'd created scholarship funds for education majors and established support groups for teachers facing financial hardship in retirement. But perhaps most importantly, they'd started a national conversation about how society treats its educators. Last month, I received a letter from a teacher in Texas, Mrs. Harrison said, pulling out a piece of paper. She wrote, "Thank you for reminding the world that teachers matter, even after we retire. For the first time in years, I feel like someone sees us, someone cares about what we've given." Mrs. Harrison paused, her voice catching slightly with emotion. "That letter reminded me why this work is so important. It's not just about money or assistance programs. It's about dignity. It's about recognizing the value of a life spent in service to others." The foundation's success had attracted national attention. Major corporations had partnered with them, donating millions of dollars. Other celebrities had followed Shaq's example, reaching out to teachers who had influenced their lives. The story of Shaq and Mrs. Harrison had been featured on every major news network, inspiring countless acts of gratitude and generosity. But for Mrs. Harrison, the most meaningful moments were still the individual connections. She kept a special file in her office of letters from teachers they'd helped, and she read through them whenever she needed motivation. There was Betty from Oregon, who'd been able to keep her house after the foundation paid off her medical debt. There was Robert from Alabama, who'd returned to tutoring after receiving the glasses he couldn't afford. There was Patricia from New York, who'd finally been able to visit her grandchildren in California after the foundation helped her catch up on her bills. Each story represented a life changed, a teacher honored, a debt of gratitude repaid. Education is not just about what happens in the classroom, Mrs. Harrison told the audience. It's about the relationships we build, the lives we touch, and the belief we instill in young people that they can achieve anything they set their minds to. After her speech, Mrs. Harrison was surrounded by educators wanting to share their own stories, ask questions about the foundation, or simply thank her for her work. Shaq watched from a distance, marveling at how natural she looked in this role. Later that evening, back in Mrs. Harrison's hotel suite, she and Shaq sat together reviewing the day's events. At 74, Mrs. Harrison had more energy and purpose than many people half her age. "I have something to show you," she said, reaching for her laptop. The foundation's impact report came in today. She pulled up a document filled with numbers and charts. In just 1 year, they'd helped over 800 retired teachers with emergency assistance. They'd funded literacy programs that reached 15,000 children. They'd provided scholarships to 200 future educators. "These numbers are incredible," Shaq said, scrolling through the report. "But I know that's not what matters most to you." Mrs. Harrison smiled. "You're right. What matters most is this." She opened another file, this one filled with photos. Pictures of teachers back in their own classrooms as volunteers. Images of children reading books in newly funded literacy centers. Photos of retirement parties where teachers didn't have to worry about their futures. "This is what success looks like," Mrs. Harrison said softly. "Not the money we've raised or the programs we've funded, but the lives we've touched." Shaq nodded, thinking about his own life and career. All the basketball achievements, all the Business successes, all the accolades and awards seemed small compared to this. This was his greatest accomplishment, not because of what he'd done, but because of what Mrs. Harrison had been able to do with the opportunity he'd provided. "You know what the best part is?" Mrs. Harrison asked. "What's that?" "I get to wake up every morning knowing that I'm still teaching. I'm still making a difference in children's lives, just in a different way. At my age, when most people are slowing down, I feel like I'm just getting started." The next morning, Mrs. Harrison was scheduled to visit 3 schools in the Chicago area, part of her regular practice of seeing their funded programs in action. At Roosevelt Elementary, she sat in a circle with second graders who were just learning to read, helping them sound out difficult words just like she had 40 years earlier. "Mrs. Harrison," one little girl asked, "are you really friends with Shaquille O'Neal?" "I am," Mrs. Harrison replied with a twinkle in her eye. "But do you know what? Before he was famous, before he was a basketball player, he was just a student in my classroom, just like you." "Really?" the children asked in amazement. "Really? And you know what I told him that I'm going to tell you? Every single one of you has something special inside you, something that makes you unique and important. My job as a teacher is to help you find that special thing and help it grow." As she spoke, Mrs. Harrison caught sight of Shaq standing in the doorway, listening to her words. Their eyes met across the classroom, and in that moment they both understood the beautiful symmetry of their story. The lost boy who had found his way with her guidance had grown into a man who could light the way for others. The teacher who had devoted her life to believing in students had been reminded that sometimes those students grow up to believe in their teachers right back. Their story had become more than just a reunion or even a rescue. It had become a reminder that gratitude, when acted upon with love and generosity, creates ripples that spread far beyond what anyone can imagine. In classrooms across the country, teachers were reading about Mrs. Harrison and feeling valued again. Retired educators were getting the help they needed. Children were learning to read in programs that might never have existed. And in a second-grade classroom in Chicago, a 74-year-old woman was still doing what she'd always done best, believing in the potential of every child, knowing that someday one of them might just change the world.